Helen Carowway has always been known as the woman who never asked for anything for herself. The daughter of immigrants, she grew up in a small wooden house where the dining table creaked, but there was always food. From a young age, she learned that silence and work were the two keys to survival in a world that offered little to women like her. Throughout her life, she held simple jobs: seamstress, kitchen assistant, supermarket cashier, always with the same attitude: saving every penny. Her children's smiles were the only currency that truly mattered to her, and every night of sleep interrupted by worry was worth it when she saw them grow up. At 74, Helen didn't flaunt her jewelry or travels. Her wealth was hidden in bank files, discreet investments, and a small safe in the basement, always organized with documents. The sum, $2.2 million, seemed incongruous with her modest appearance. Simple clothes, worn-out shoes, hair tied in a hasty bun. But that fortune wasn't for her. It was for her family, to ensure that no one would go through what she had. The idea that her children might one day have financial security was the fuel that fueled her decades of sacrifice. Until recently, Helen believed loyalty was a kind of silent inheritance she had passed down. But in recent years, she began to notice something she wouldn't admit aloud: a cold detachment in her daughter Diana, and a hidden ambition in her daughter-in-law Renee. The way they whispered when they talked about their money, calculating looks during family gatherings, and the way they avoided discussing gratitude were signs Helen registered mentally. She wasn't naive, though she pretended to be. There was a growing distrust within her, like a shadow. The collapse came suddenly. One gray morning, while watering her plants, Helen felt her chest heave and the air escape her as if someone had pulled an invisible thread. When she woke, she was already in an intensive care unit surrounded by machines beeping in, different rhythms, tubes attached to her body, and a cold that didn't just come from the air conditioning. Unable to speak, she communicated only with her eyes, and there, in the most fragile moment of her existence, she realized she was about to face not only the fight for her life, but also for her own dignity. It was in this vulnerable state that she heard the first sentence that tore at her heart. "It's better this way," Diana murmured softly, believing her mother was unconscious. Helen, however, heard every word. Her daughter spoke almost bureaucratically, as if discussing a contract. "We've already taken the money. It's settled." Those words were crueler than any physical pain her body could endure. It was as if decades of sacrifice had been reduced to a cold calculation. The second blow came when she felt Renee's hand gently touch the oxygen tube. There was no force in the gesture, but rather a suggestion, a test of power. Helen realized they were deciding whether she should stay alive. The feeling of being disposable by those who should have defended her burned through her mind in an overwhelming way. In the silence forced by the mask, she screamed to herself, promising that if she survived, she would not be the same woman she had been before. What Diana and Renee didn't know was that Helen had never blindly trusted their affection. Secretly, she had set up a nearly paranoid safety net, blocked accounts that only released funds upon proof of life, legal clauses, written with the help of a discreet lawyer, and even hidden recordings in her own home. This instinct for self-preservation, which many interpreted as an exaggeration of a suspicious elderly woman, now revealed itself to be her greatest weapon. As she struggled to breathe, Helen remembered the secret conversations she'd had with Linda, her most loyal friend. Linda was the kind of woman who saw beyond appearances: watchful eyes, a firm voice, and a courage that inspired confidence. She was one who helped Helen structure her Plan B, who held her friend's hand when she confessed her fear of being betrayed by her own family. Linda had promised, "If they ever try to extinguish you, I will turn on every light you've set up." Michael, the youngest son, was also part of this inner circle. Unlike his sister, he had inherited his mother's discretion and quiet ethics. He worked as a university professor, and his simple life didn't prevent him from being Helen's moral guardian. He was suspicious of Diana and Renee, but never wanted to confront them. Now, however, the time to act had come. The evidence Helen had gathered over the years was in his hands, and he knew it would take courage to expose the truth. In that hospital bed, Helen realized something that would forever change the way she viewed her story. It was no longer just about surviving the physical attack, but about resisting the emotional erasure. The theft had not only been of money, but of trust, of her place as a mother, of the recognition of a lifetime. It hurt more than any syringe or scalpel, but it also awakened in her a strength that, ironically, the traitors themselves had underestimated. Days passed, and the fragility of her body contrasted with the lucidity of her mind. Helen overheard nurses' conversations, family members' suspicious glances, and felt the urgency of time. Each beat of the heart monitor was a reminder that the truth needed to come out. She couldn't speak, but she had left everything ready for the right moment. The recordings, documents, and even the extracts were organized in a blue folder, which Michael knew exactly where to find. The turning point began when Linda entered the hospital with an expression that blended tenderness and determination. She approached the bed and whispered, "Everything's ready, Helen. They don't know it, but the game is over." At that moment, a spark of relief shone in the elderly woman's tired eyes. Even without being able to utter a word, Helen understood that her silent struggle had not been in vain. The trap was set, and soon the whole world would know who the woman everyone thought helpless really was. In the hospital, while the machines still dictated the pace of Helen's survival, Linda walked the corridors with firm steps, carrying with her not only the concern of a friend, but also the responsibility of a keeper of secrets. The nurse's watchful eyes didn't intimidate her. She knew this was the moment to turn suspicions into action, and so she called Michael, asking him to come immediately. The news he brought confirmed everything. The accounts had been moved, but the block prevented a single cent from being withdrawn without final authentication. Diana and Renee had fallen into the trap. Michael arrived at the hospital with a tense expression. His shoulders weighed heavily, as if bearing not only his mother's fate, but also the responsibility of exposing his own sister. When he entered the room, he bent down before Helen and squeezed her cold hand. She blinked slowly, as if confirming her awareness. In that silent gesture, a pact was renewed. He would be the voice she couldn't use, the shield that would transform her pain into justice. Meanwhile, Diana believed she had mastered the game. With her persuasive speech and calculated tone, she had convinced part of the family that she was simply looking out for the future. "Mommy can't handle money anymore. It's for her own good," she said, playing the role of a worried daughter. Renee, always by her side, reinforced the act with easy tears and looks of false compassion. But behind the scenes, they both waited only for the news that Helen would not survive. What they didn't anticipate was that the silent, sterile ICU had become the stage for a larger plot. The heart monitor, recording every beat, seemed to also keep pace with the revelation. Helen, lying there, felt her life hanging by a thread. But inside her mind, past the film of the played out clearly. She remembered every revised contract, every late night spent saving documents, and the promise she'd made to herself. she would never let her story be stolen. Linda and Michael met at a coffee shop near the hospital to discuss their next steps. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the weight of the conversation. "We have everything," Michael said, opening the blue folder he carried under his arm. Inside were the recordings of Diana speaking, explicitly about resolving her mother's situation, as well as illegal bank transfers and compromising messages exchanged between her and Renee. The evidence was irrefutable. Linda took a deep breath and replied, "Then it's time to show the world who you really are." That night, as Diana left the hospital, believing her mother wouldn't last long, Michael contacted a trusted lawyer. The man, with gray hair and a sharp gaze, wasn't surprised to hear the story. "Unfortunately, cases like this happen more often than you think," he commented, as he organized the evidence to take to the authorities. There was, however, a crucial difference. Rarely had a victim prepared so well, anticipating the betrayal. Helen didn't just suspect, she engineered her own salvation. Days later, the police officially received the complaint. An investigation was launched and undercover agents began tracking Diana and Renee. Their every move was now monitored. Their visits to the bank, their conversations in discreet cafes, their nervous phone calls when they realized they couldn't access the money. Helen, still in the hospital, didn't know the details, but she felt a strange calm in her chest. With every breath she held, the day when the truth would explode grew closer. The news first broke in the local papers. "Elderly woman victim of attempted multi-million-dollar fraud, family members under investigation," read the discreet headline. Diana read it and felt her stomach churn. Renee tried to calm her, but they both knew her mask was beginning to crack. At the hospital, Linda entered Helen's room with the newspaper in hand, showing the headline. The tears that welled in Helen's eyes were not of sadness, but of relief. Even without a voice, her story was beginning to be told outside the walls of that ICU. The trigger was lit when investigators entered the hospital with warrants in hand. In front of nurses, doctors, and even other patients, Diana and Renee were approached, questioned, and then taken into custody. The shock was immediate. Their image as caring daughter and devoted daughter-in-law crumbled in seconds. Helen, lying down, watched the scene with teary eyes. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her silent preparation had spoken louder. The pre-trial detention of the two women made national news. Reporters surrounded the hospital, cameras searched for shots of Diana's handcuffed exit, and commentators debated how a mother could be so brutally betrayed. Public opinion was divided between shock and outrage, but one thing was clear. Helen Carowway was no longer just a critically ill patient and had become a symbol of resistance against the silent abuse suffered by many elderly people. Inside the ICU, doctors noticed a change in Helen's expression. Her vital signs improved, as if her soul found fuel in the simple act of being heard. The air entering her lungs was no longer just oxygen. It was the certainty that her life, so underestimated, now carried no one could ignore. Linda, at her side, squeezed her hand and said, "You won the first battle, my friend. Now it's time to show the world how to transform pain into strength." In that environment still filled with machines and tubes, Helen began to feel an idea that would change everything blossom within her. It wasn't enough to survive. It wasn't enough to see the traitors imprisoned. She wanted to transform that suffering into something greater, something that would ensure that other women, like her, wouldn't go through the same. The seed of the Helen Carowway Foundation for Dignity in Aging germinated there, amid the constant din of the monitors, ready to blossom in the name of all the silenced voices. The following days were a strange mix of silence and noise. Inside the ICU, the atmosphere remained controlled, amidst whistles and the low voices of nurses. But outside, Helen's life was in turmoil. Television stations were stationed outside the hospital, journalists called Michael insistently, and reporters tried to extract statements from neighbors. Suddenly, this discreet woman who had always gone unnoticed on the neighborhood streets became national headline news. Her story took on the form of a symbol, and her image of fragility became an emblem of resistance. As the news continued to roll, Helen struggled to reclaim small victories. The simple act of moving her fingers, opening her eyes for longer, slowly moving her head became a cause for celebration. For the old doctors, it was expected progress, but for her, each breakthrough was an affirmation. I'm still here. The strength that came from within wasn't just biological, it was spiritual, emotional, fueled by the desire to show the world that a lifelong silence isn't just a simple oxygen tube. Michael closely monitored his mother's recovery, while also finding himself dragged into interviews and press conferences. Always discreet, he now had to answer in front of the cameras. My mother isn't just a victim. She's a woman who foresaw danger and prepared herself. If she's alive today, it's because she never stopped believing the truth would come out. These words resonated intensely, and within days, messages of support began arriving from all over the country. Letters, flowers, emails, even children sent drawings with phrases like, "Stay strong, Mrs. Helen." At the hospital, Linda read some of these messages aloud to Helen. With each encouraging word, the elderly woman's eyes sparkled. The oxygen mask. She felt a collective energy reaching out to her, as if strangers were coming together to remind her that her life had value. It was a stark contrast to Diana's cold words. The kindness from strangers healed her more than any medicine. There, Helen understood that her personal pain had transcended the confines of her family and become a public cause. Meanwhile, Diana and Renee were held in pre-trial detention, with lawyers trying their best to reverse the situation. Images the two of them entering the courtroom in handcuffs circulated nationwide. The social shock was immense. Who could have imagined that a daughter would attempt to rob and murder her own mother? In the halls of justice, the commotion was palpable. People crowded to attend the hearings, often more interested in seeing Helen than listening to the lawyers. The elderly woman became a reference point for something that had previously been silenced: financial abuse against the elderly. Helen received daily updates on the case's progress. Linda made a point of updating her, describing every detail of what was happening in court. Her still weakened body prevented her from being physically present, but her presence was felt at every hearing. When a prosecutor described the evidence of fraud using the secret recordings she left behind, the courtroom fell silent. It was as if Helen were speaking from beyond the grave, as if she had prepared her own words to be used against those who tried to erase her. Gradually, Helen's recovery allowed her to leave the ICU. The day she was transferred to a regular room was celebrated as a collective victory. Journalists recorded her departure, and even weakened, using a wheelchair and with sheets covering her legs, she raised her hand in a timid gesture of a wave. The images traveled the country and went viral on social media. The most shared caption read, "She survived." This wasn't just a medical fact. It was a political statement, emotional and symbolic. During lonely nights in the hospital, Helen reflected on everything she had experienced. She couldn't erase the pain of betrayal, but she realized she had a rare opportunity to transform scars into seeds. If so many elderly, abandoned, and silent women saw a reflection in her, perhaps it was time to build something bigger. Thus, the concrete idea of a foundation was born. It wouldn't just be a tribute to her suffering, but a real support network for anyone in the same position. "I don't want any woman to feel what I felt," she thought. Michael and Linda immediately embraced the idea. Sitting beside the bed, they began jotting down proposals in a simple notebook, the kind with a blue cover and thick lines. "Helen Carowway, Foundation for Dignity in Aging," Linda wrote, with a firmness that seemed to foresee the impact it would have. With every word, Helen smiled. There was nothing more powerful than transforming pain into a legacy. And now, even while still recovering, she knew she had a new purpose. Helen's first press conference was broadcast nationally. Still fragile, with a hoarse, halting voice, she managed to say, "I'm not just a victim. I'm a survivor, and I want all women my age to know that we still have a voice." The room erupted in applause, and thousands watched on television and online. In that moment, Helen stopped being just a resilient woman. She became an unexpected leader. From then on, every step of Helen's recovery was watched by the public as if it were a collective event. When she managed to take her first steps alone, supported by a walker, journalists recorded it. When she left the hospital, surrounded by neighbors and strangers who applauded her, it was like witnessing a rebirth. She returned home not as the reserved woman she once was, but as someone who had traversed the darkness and now carried with her the torch of one who lights the way for others. Diana and Renee's trial was still ongoing, but Helen no longer expected revenge. What truly mattered was that her name, her story, and her life had not been erased. She had won, and now she was ready to give the world something greater than the pain she had suffered. The foundation was just the beginning, and more people were offering to help. It was as if life, after so much silence, had finally given her a voice louder than ever. The courtroom was packed on the day Helen, for the first time since her recovery, decided to appear. It wasn't an easy choice. She still used a cane and walked slowly, but she wanted to be present to look into the eyes of the one who had tried to erase her existence. When she entered, silence filled the room. It was impossible not to notice the contrast between her physical fragility and the moral, imposing nature she carried. Each step echoed like a silent protest, reminding everyone that she was still standing. Diana, handcuffed, looked away. She couldn't bear to look at the mother who had once given her everything. Renee, beside her, maintained a cold expression as if she still believed there was a way out. But in that moment, faced with Helen's silent strength, they both seemed smaller than ever. Reporters recorded every detail, from the handshake between Helen and the lawyer to the way she sat calmly, adjusting her handkerchief in her lap. The scene was so symbolic that many would compare it to an act of historic resistance. As the judge began the hearing, the evidence was presented one by one. Recordings of Diana's voice discussing how to solve her mother's situation, bank statements, text messages with plans to manipulate hospital equipment, all displayed on a large screen for the jurors. Helen watched in silence, but inside she felt a whirlwind of emotions. It was like reliving every wound, only now in front of the entire country. The weight of betrayal was made public, but with it came liberation. At one point, the defense tried to paint Diana as a confused daughter, pressured by financial problems. She didn't wish her mother any harm, she was just desperate, the lawyer argued. It was then that Helen, asking the judge for permission, stood up. Her voice was still weak, but each word carried relentless force. Desperation doesn't justify trying to kill one's own mother. Those who love protect, they don't destroy. The sentence echoed in the courtroom, and for a few seconds, not even the judge could hide his emotion. The direct confrontation occurred during halftime when Diana, no longer able to hold her mask on, asked to speak to Helen. Her mother, accompanied by security guards, agreed. "I don't know what to say," Diana began, her tears appearing less like regret and more like self-pity. Helen stared at her for long seconds, silent. Then she replied, "Today is the day your mother said she outlived you." There was no shouting, no anger, just the cutting coldness of someone who decides to no longer carry the weight of another's guilt. The trial dragged on, but the sentence seemed inevitable. Diana and Renee were convicted of fraud, attempted murder, and robbery. The news resonated not just as an isolated case, but as a national wake-up call. Television programs began discussing the issue of elder abuse, and experts emphasized the need to create safety nets. Helen, who had always lived anonymously, became a leading figure in the fight against a systemic problem. As she left the courtroom after the sentencing, Helen was greeted by people who had never seen her before, held makeshift signs with messages of support. An elderly woman approached, took her hand and said, "You spoke for all of us." Helen smiled, moved. In that moment, she realized that her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to all the women who spent their lives invisible, silenced, or exploited by those who should have cared for them. At home, her routine began to change. Between physical therapy and medical follow-up sessions, Helen dedicated hours to the foundation, which was now growing. The phone rang non-stop, with volunteers offering help and organizations seeking support. Michael handled the administrative side, while Linda mobilized community contacts. Helen, even weakened, insisted on being involved in every decision. "It's not about me," she said. "It's about all the voices that never had a chance to be heard." The official inauguration of the Helen Carowway Foundation took place in a simple but packed auditorium. Elderly people, family members, journalists, and representatives of social organizations were in attendance. Helen took the stage with slow but steady steps and delivered her speech. "They transformed my pain into an attempt at silence, but today I transform that pain into a collective voice. Every older woman deserves respect, dignity, and protection. We can no longer accept lives being treated as disposable." The audience rose to their feet in applause, many with tears in their eyes. Impact was immediate. Donations began pouring in from across the country. Celebrities expressed their support, and even government officials requested meetings with Helen to discuss public policy. What began as a personal drama now became a movement. Helen wasn't seeking fame, but she understood that her name had become a banner. And instead of backing down, she decided to use it to open doors for other women who hadn't had the same opportunity. Amidst all this, Helen continued to grapple with her own emotional wounds. There were nights when she would wake up frightened, remembering Renee's touch on the oxygen tube or Diana's cold words. Therapy became an essential part of her routine, and there she found space to cry and rebuild herself without masks. "I survived, but I also need to heal," she confessed to her psychologist. This vulnerability made her even more human in the public eye. By the end of that year, Helen's life was completely different. The money she had saved with such sacrifice was no longer just in accounts. It was invested in something bigger, in a network that protected other women. The pain of betrayal still lingered, but it had been reframed. Helen was no longer just a mother who suffered at the hands of her own daughter. She had become the face of restored dignity, of silent resistance that transforms into revolution. The Helen Carowway Foundation's first months of operation were intense. The still modest physical space soon filled with voices and stories. Elderly women who had never spoken of their suffering began seeking help. Some arrived in tears, others with a wounded dignity barely contained within their bodies. Helen made a point of listening to them, one by one, even if time and health limited her presence. "If I can't give each one what they deserve, at least I will lend my ears and my heart," she would say, as she welcomed women who had felt invisible for decades. The social impact was immediate. Within weeks, newspapers began calling the movement the awakening of silenced voices. Helen's story, which had begun as a family scandal, now inspired legislative changes. Politicians met to discuss stricter laws against financial and emotional abuse of the elderly. Helen's name echoed in the halls of power, and even without seeking it, she had become a national figure. Yet, she maintained the same simple manner as always, refusing titles or pompous honors. Michael took on much of the foundation's practical organization, but he always made it clear that the heart of the project was his mother. He watched her with a mixture of pride and sadness, pride in the strength she exuded, sadness in knowing that it all stemmed from a deep wound. "It's like watching a tree blossom after it was nearly uprooted," he would say to Linda. Her friend, in turn, was always by her side, reminding everyone that Helen's strength also came from the courage to surround herself with loyal people. Over time, the foundation began offering not only psychological and legal support, but also social reintegration workshops. Elderly women learned computer skills, resumed interrupted studies, and rediscovered joy in artistic pursuits. Helen attended the inaugurations of these workshops, and each time she saw a woman smile as she learned something new, she felt as if the weight of the past became lighter. It was a way of telling herself, "I survived for something greater." Despite all the progress, Helen endured her nights of silence. The memory of her daughter was still a haunting presence. There were days when she wondered where she had failed, at what point love had turned into ambition. But instead of allowing herself to be consumed by grief, she chose to use these thoughts as fuel. "If even my daughter could try to destroy me, how many other women suffer in silence at home?" she reflected. It was a constant reminder that her mission could not be stopped. The letters that arrived at the foundation became a daily ritual. Helen read stories from women from different parts of the country, some living in conditions of extreme neglect. "Your story gave me the courage to report my own son," wrote one. "Now I know I'm not alone." Each letter was kept in a wooden box that Helen called my treasure. More than money or recognition, those words were proof that her pain had transformed into strength for many others. Television and radio stations frequently requested interviews, and Helen, even though she was tired, accepted some. Not out of vanity, but because she understood the power of words. In one of these interviews, she said something that resonated with the public. "I saved 2.2 million in cash. But I discovered that the true treasure I can leave behind is the courage to speak. Money can be stolen, courage cannot." The phrase went viral, being shared by thousands of people on social media, printed on posters, and even quoted in schools. Meanwhile, Diana and Renee faced the consequences of their conviction. Press visits to the prison revealed 2 women aging prematurely, worn down by the reality of incarceration. Helen, however, avoided following this news. She had already decided she didn't want to feed into their downfall. For her, the cycle of justice was over. "Revenge would keep me stuck in the same place. I want to move forward," she confided to Linda on a quiet afternoon in the garden. Neighbors, who had previously seen Helen as a reserved woman, now treated her as an inspiration. Young women stopped by her door to thank her. Mothers brought their teenage daughters to hear her speak about strength and dignity. Helen, ever humble, replied, "I only did what had to be done to survive." But deep down, she knew she had done much more. She had opened a door that had long remained closed to women like her. As the foundation grew, invitations began to arrive from universities and conferences. Helen, despite her physical limitations, agreed to speak at one of these events. On stage, in front of students and academics, she recounted her story in detail. At the end, a 20-year-old woman stood up and said, "You showed me that age is never an excuse to give up on yourself." Helen smiled, moved. This was exactly the message she wanted to convey, that there is no age limit to rewrite your own story. Life, once marked by discretion, now pulsed with intensity. Helen had more commitments, more people around her, more reasons to wake up every day. But, above all, she had peace. A peace built not on the absence of pain, but on the choice to transform pain into purpose. She felt she could finally breathe without fear, that each breath was a victory against those who tried to silence her voice. For the first time in a long time, she felt whole. And so, Helen began to glimpse something she had never allowed herself: hope for the future. Not just for herself, but for all the women who had found courage along her path. If before she had believed her legacy was made up only of numbers in bank accounts, now she knew that her true wealth lay in the seed planted in every heart that dared to stand up against the silence. It was this legacy she had chosen to leave, and in it lay her peace. The foundation, which began in a simple building, soon needed to expand. Donations from ordinary people and even large corporations enabled the opening of new branches in other cities. Each location bore Helen's name, but she made a point of reminding everyone, "It's not about me, it's about all of us." Newspapers reported the expansion as a historic movement, comparing it to social milestones of previous decades. Helen watched it all humbly, never losing her habit of arranging the flowers in the main hall before each inauguration. Soon, the foundation became recognized as a national leader in combating elder abuse. Universities approached it, proposing joint research and projects. The topic, once considered taboo, now occupied space in lectures, seminars, television programs. Helen, who had spent her life in silence, became a respected name in academic and political circles. But for her, what mattered most was listening to the stories of each woman she met, sitting beside them and saying, "I believe in you." Despite her success, Helen knew that fame also brought burdens. There were nights when she dreamed of her daughter, of that cold gaze in the hospital room. She woke frightened, her heart racing, as if she were still hooked up to that oxygen tube. At those times, she walked to the balcony, took a deep breath, and reminded herself, "I survived. I'm alive. This is bigger than any shadow." Little by little, she learned not to let the ghosts of the past dominate the present. Michael remained by her side, acting as the foundation's right-hand man. He handled the most difficult negotiations, filtered invitations, and protected his mother from excessive stress. Helen was proud of her son, but also recognized the burden he carried. Night, sitting together in the kitchen, she told him, "I don't want my pain to be your prison. You have the right to live your life too." Michael smiled and replied, "Mom, I'm not trapped. I'm free because you survived." Linda, always present, maintained the same vigilant spirit. She never let Helen forget to rest, nor let her be overwhelmed by too many commitments. More than a friend, she had become almost a sister. It was she who reminded her, "You turned your pain into a struggle, but don't forget that you're still human. You can cry, you can rest." This partnership was proof that true loyalty cannot be bought, betrayed, or broken in the face of storms. Helen's case opened the door to thousands of complaints across the country. Hotlines set up by the foundation received reports daily. Often, women called simply to say, Thank you, now I have courage. The foundation's staff mobilized to provide immediate support, creating a network of lawyers, psychologists, and social workers. What began as a response to a personal tragedy now became a quiet revolution. Helen followed each statistic with teary eyes, aware of the scope of her choice. Amidst so much work, Helen still sought small moments of normalcy. She enjoyed tending her garden, making chamomile tea in the late afternoon, listening to old songs that reminded her of her youth. It was in these simple moments that she rediscovered the taste of everyday life, something that had almost been stolen from her. Flowers remind me that beauty endures even after the harshest winter, she would say, as she calmly watered her plants. One day, Helen was invited to speak at the National Congress. The hall was packed, television cameras broadcast live, and parliamentarians from every region awaited her words. When she took the podium, leaning on her cane, the silence was absolute. I didn't come here as a victim. I came as a survivor. What happened to me is no exception. It's a reality for thousands of women, and their silence is what hurts the most. Today, I ask that this silence end. The speech received a standing ovation, echoing for weeks. The impact was so great that bills began to be voted on urgently. Soon, measures were approved that expanded financial and legal protection for the elderly. Helen, upon hearing the news, cried alone in her room. They weren't tears of pain, but of relief. It was worth every night of fear, every scar. I turned my story into real change, she murmured. The old family photo she still kept on the shelf. Despite everything, Helen didn't seek recognition. She declined invitations to pose on magazine covers or participate in campaigns that sought to exploit her image. For her, the essential thing was that the foundation remained strong even after she was no longer here. My voice doesn't need to be eternal, but the cause does, she would tell everyone she met. This awareness of her legacy was what kept her going, even in the face of physical exhaustion. Little by little, Helen was also discovering a new way of experiencing motherhood. If Diana had lost herself to ambition, hundreds of other younger women began to see her as a symbolic maternal figure. She received letters calling her the mother of courage, the mother of dignity. At first, this deeply moved her. Later, she began to understand that it was a natural role. I may have lost one daughter, but I have gained thousands, she would say with a serene smile. Over time, the name Helen Carowway ceased to be just a newspaper headline. It became synonymous with resilience, a reminder that even the most muffled voices can echo louder than the violence they attempted to impose. Helen, looking back, understood that she couldn't change what had happened, but she could choose what to do with what remained. And that choice, turning pain into legacy, was the greatest victory of her life. As time passed, Helen realized that her greatest enemy was no longer outside, but within. Her quiet nights were still interrupted by sharp memories of the hospital, the metallic cold of the machines, Renee's touch on the oxygen tube, Diana's icy whisper, "It's better this way." These memories came back to her like echoes, sometimes so vivid that she found herself gasping, as if she were back in that bed. It wasn't just her body that needed healing. It was her soul, scarred by invisible wounds. It was in therapy that Helen found space to pour out these pains. Sitting in a simple armchair facing a young psychologist who listened attentively, she was able to speak without needing to be a symbol, without needing to be strong for others. There, she was simply a betrayed mother, a wounded woman trying to rebuild herself. "I survived my daughter," she once said, and the phrase echoed in the office with an unbearable weight. But saying it aloud also gave her the beginnings of a liberation. Despite the emotional scars, Helen discovered new reasons to smile. Small gestures reconnected her with life. The smell of bread baking in the oven, the sound of birds in the yard, the spontaneous laughter of a child passing by. It's as if the world had taken on colors I'd never noticed before, she told Linda. This rediscovery of the everyday was her way of reconciling herself with existence, proving to herself that she could still feel genuine joy. The relationship with Michael also gained new layers. Before, he was just the loyal, always silent son. Now, he had become a partner, a confidant, an accomplice in a greater purpose. Many nights they talked late into the night, not just about the foundation, but about life, their fears, their hopes. "You know, Mom," he once said, "I thought you were hoarding money, but now I see you were hoarding strength, and that strength inspires me." Helen smiled, moved, understanding that she had passed on something much greater to her son than material possessions. Linda, for her part, remained a steadfast support. Relapse in moments when Helen was shaken by the weight of betrayal. She was the one who reminded her, "You don't owe your peace to those who try to destroy you. Your peace is yours alone." These words, repeated countless times, became almost a mantra. Helen knew she wouldn't have come this far without that loyal friendship, and she often wondered if she could repay such dedication. Linda always responded with a smile. "Your life is the retribution." As the foundation grew, Helen began to allow herself some respite. She accepted invitations to visit simple places she'd always wanted to see, like botanical gardens and small historic towns. On these short trips, she rediscovered the beauty of the world, feeling like a young woman exploring life for the first time. "It's strange to think that I had to almost die to learn how to live," she said on one such visit, while observing rare flowers in a conservatory. Still, internal dilemmas persisted. Helen wondered if she would ever be able to forgive Diana, not for her sake, but for herself. The hurt was too deep, but she also knew that carrying hatred was like carrying a lead weight. In conversations with her therapist, she began to explore the idea of a silent, unspoken forgiveness that would allow her to move forward unfettered. "I don't need to take her back. I just need to let go of what still holds me back," she reflected. In an unexpected gesture, Helen decided to write a letter to Diana, but not to send it. The words flowed, as if they were a confession to herself. "You tried to erase me, but you couldn't. I survived. I don't expect an apology. I don't expect regret. I just want you to know that I no longer carry you as a burden." When she finished, she put the letter in a drawer, feeling lighter. It was an intimate ritual, almost an exorcism of the pain that still lingered in her memory. Connecting with other women who had been through similar situations also helped with healing. Many of them became close friends, and together they created a kind of sisterhood. They shared stories, cried together, and laughed at small victories. Helen saw herself reflected in them, but also found inspiration in the different forms of resilience each brought. This support network was not just an extension of the foundation, but a space for genuine exchange. One day, one of the women the foundation helped told her, "If your own daughter tried to destroy you and you stood up for yourself, who am I to give up?" Helen took that phrase to heart. She realized that her overcoming wasn't just personal, but also collective. Every step she took toward peace influenced dozens of other women to take their own steps. This awareness made her healing process even more meaningful. Helen learned to look in the mirror differently. Before, she saw only the marks of age, the wrinkles that told stories of sacrifice. Now, she saw them as war scars, memories of battles won. Her gray hair, which she had once hidden in tight buns. Now, those strands are medals, she would say, smiling at her reflection. It was her way of reclaiming beauty in her own body without having to conform to standards. At the end of each day, when she retired to her room, Helen felt a serenity she had never known before. It wasn't an absence of pain, but a peaceful coexistence with it. It was like learning to live with a scar. It doesn't disappear, but it stops hurting. Helen finally understood that survival wasn't just about enduring, but also about choosing how to live after the storm. And in that choice, she found her true freedom. Over the years, the Helen Carowway Foundation grew from a mere refuge for vulnerable elderly women to a solid, nationally recognized network. Service centers were opened in various states, and Helen's name was cited at international conferences on dignified aging. Academics studied her as a case study of social resistance. Politicians used her as an example in speeches, but Helen always repeated, "I didn't fight for stages, I fought for kitchen tables where so many women weep in silence." The tributes began to multiply. A documentary telling her story was made and broadcast in prime time. In it, images from the hospital, interviews with Michael, Linda, and women, helped by the foundation, constructed a narrative of courage and rebirth. Helen watched it at home, sitting in her favorite armchair, and wept silently. Not out of vanity, but because she realized that her life, previously invisible, now served as a mirror for so many others. It was as if her pain had finally found meaning. Despite her notoriety, Helen never lost her simple nature. She continued to attend foundation meetings in person, sitting in ordinary chairs, listening attentively to each story. To those who saw her up close, she didn't seem like a celebrity, but rather an ordinary woman with deep eyes and a calm voice. Perhaps that was precisely what made her so inspiring, the feeling that anyone could find within themselves the same strength she had discovered. In one of her most memorable speeches, Helen stated, "My daughter tried to silence me, but ended up giving me a voice that echoes beyond her. I survived not only for myself, but for all those who have yet to be heard." This phrase gained worldwide repercussion, translated into several languages and shared in awareness campaigns. Helen, who had spent her life hoarding money in silence, now hoarded words that crossed borders. Even with all the recognition, Helen maintained a critical eye on herself. There were days when she questioned whether she had truly done enough. "Will what I've built last after me?" she wondered as she reviewed the foundation's reports. Michael always reassured her, "Mom, what you planted is already flourishing. Even if one day the foundation's doors close, the courage you inspired will never fade." These words comforted her, but they also reinforced her responsibility. As she grew older, Helen began to reflect more on her remaining time. The marks on her body became more pronounced. Her steps slowed, but her mind remained lucid and active. She felt she was entering a phase of preparation. Fewer external battles, more surrender to her internal legacy. She told herself, "I'm not afraid of death. I'm afraid of not leaving something that truly makes a difference." This awareness led her to plan every detail of the foundation so that it would survive without relying on her. One of the most moving moments of her career came when she received a surprise tribute organized by women served by the foundation. In the auditorium, dozens of them took the stage to tell their stories of transformation. One woman declared, "If it weren't for you, I would have given up on life." Another added, "You showed me that my voice still matters." Helen wept openly, feeling that her life had multiplied into other lives. "You are my true legacy," she said, hugging them. Despite everything, Helen never forgot her daughter. Diana, now serving a prison sentence, was no longer part of her everyday life. but she continued to inhabit her thoughts. Helen didn't harbor hatred, but she also harbored no illusions. She knew that not all stories end in reconciliation. In a conversation with her therapist, she summed it up this way: "I didn't forgive for her. I forgave for myself because my freedom couldn't depend on someone who wanted me dead." This was perhaps the most radical act of autonomy she had ever undertaken. Helen never mentioned her relationship with Renee publicly, and she was keen to avoid fueling speculation. "I don't want my life to be reduced to villains and victims. I want it to be remembered as a path of resistance." This stance prevented her story from becoming a mere spectacle. For Helen, the true victory lay in being remembered for the foundation she had created, not just for the crime she had suffered. Over time, invitations began to pour in for Helen to write a book about her life. The idea scared her at first, but gradually she realized it could be another way to leave her voice. Alongside Michael and Linda, she began dictating memoirs, describing not only the trauma and overcoming, but also the simple details of life, the smell of wet earth in her childhood, the nights spent sewing, the savings saved in envelopes. "I want them to know who I was before all this, an ordinary life that suddenly became a symbol." This book, upon its release, became a bestseller, titled "I Survived You." The cover featured the firm gaze of Helen, already elderly but imposing. Within its pages, there was not only denunciation, but also tenderness, poetry, and reflection. Readers of all ages identified with her words, and many said they found the courage to face their own ghosts. Helen smiled as she signed copies, knowing that her legacy was now also in print. Arriving home after one of these events, Helen sat in her armchair surrounded by flowers, sent by admirers. She looked at Michael and Linda and said, "I never imagined my life so silent would become so noisy." They laughed together, but deep down they knew the noise wasn't noise, but an echo. The echo of a woman who, in her most fragile moment, found her greatest strength and transformed it into a legacy for the world. Time, always relentless, began to take a more intense toll on Helen's body. Her steps became shorter, her hands trembled as she held her teacup, and her nights were marked by long stretches of insomnia. But unlike years ago, these frailties no longer frightened her. "Every line on my face is a reminder that I survived another day," she would say, looking in the mirror. The serenity she now possessed was the fruit of a life with new meaning. At the foundation, Helen no longer attended daily, but her presence was felt in every room, on every poster, in every volunteer who repeated her words. The new generations of women who took over leadership made a point of keeping the founder's essence alive: welcome, dignity, and courage. Helen watched from afar, smiling whenever she received reports and photos of new center inaugurations. She knew the work was bigger than herself, and this filled her with peace. Visits to her home became more frequent. Women who had been helped by the foundation made a point of thanking her personally. Some brought flowers, others just a silent hug. Helen welcomed them all with the same warmth, even though her already tired body prevented long conversations. For many, being in her presence was like encountering living proof that it was possible to rebuild even after the greatest pain. "You are hope in the flesh," she heard from an 82-year-old woman, and those words resonated deeply. Helen also found strength in Michael's grandchildren. Playing with them was like reliving a lighter motherhood, without the demands and burdens of the past. She would sit in the garden and tell stories, some made up, others drawn from her own life. "Your grandmother fought invisible giants," she would tell the children, who looked at her with admiration. For Helen, it was a balm to know that Even if she hadn't had a healthy relationship with Diana, she could still experience the sweetness of family through the new generation. In her later years, Helen cultivated an intimate ritual, writing letters to herself. They were reflections, memories, silent prayers. She kept them all in a wooden box beside her bed. Not
These
for
letters
others, they are for me, so that I never forget that I was here, that I fought, and that I survived. Often, when rereading her own writings, she wept alone, but it was a cry of gratitude, not sadness. Life, though hard, had been meaningful. Public recognition continued, but Helen increasingly retreated from the spotlight. She declined grand invitations, preferring small community gatherings. "The cameras have already told my story. Now I just want to live in peace," she said. This choice made her even more admired, because it showed she wasn't seeking glory, only dignity. And dignity was precisely the center of everything she had built. In one of her final public appearances, Helen was honored in front of a packed auditorium. She received a symbolic plaque, and as she took the stage with Michael's help, said a few words: "I survived, and if I survived, you can too. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The audience gave a standing ovation, many with tears streaming down their faces. That simple statement summed up her entire journey, like a testament left in life. The nights grew increasingly silent. Helen spent hours sitting on the porch, gazing at the sky. She liked to gaze at the stars and think that her story was now part of something bigger, as if each light in the sky were a woman who had found strength through her. "I'm not afraid of the end," she would say to Linda in one of these conversations. "I'm only afraid of not having loved enough." Linda would hold her hand and respond, "You loved more than you could ever imagine." The day of farewell arrived without fanfare on a quiet autumn morning. Helen left at home, lying in bed, with Michael and Linda by her side. There was no visible pain, only a long sigh, as if finally resting after a long battle. On the nightstand, the box of letters remained closed, a symbol of all she had kept silent and chosen to transform into a legacy. The funeral was simple, exactly as Helen had wanted. However, thousands of people turned out to pay their respects. Elderly women cared for by the foundation, young people inspired by her story, politicians, journalists, and ordinary citizens. The coffin, surrounded by white flowers, was carried in silence, but the emotional weight was immense. Everyone knew they were burying not just a woman, but closing a chapter of courage that had changed the lives of thousands. At the podium, Michael spoke with a choked voice. "My mother survived the greatest pain anyone can face, the betrayal of her own daughter. But she didn't let it consume her. She transformed her pain into hope for thousands of women. Today, she lives in peace, and we are left with the mission of carrying on her legacy." His words were met with respectful applause, as if the audience wanted to seal their commitment to keeping Helen's memory alive. And so, Helen Carowway's story didn't end with her death. The foundation continued to grow, her image plastered on murals, her phrase, "I survived," transformed into a motto. In many women's homes, her photo remained as inspiration. Helen was gone, but her voice continued to echo, no longer through tubes and machines, but in the lives of every person who learned from her that it's never too late to reclaim one's dignity. Over time, Helen's physical absence became a symbolic presence. In the foundation's hallways, her portrait occupied a simple space surrounded by fresh flowers that volunteers made a point of refreshing daily. There was no luxury, just the constant memory of the woman who had transformed silence into a voice. Young volunteers who had never met her personally would repeat her phrases at meetings. Money can be stolen, but courage cannot. It was as if Helen still guided their every step, the foundation expanded beyond national borders. Inspired by her story, organizations in other countries began replicating the model. At international seminars, Helen's name was cited as an example of resilience and social innovation. The legacy born from the private pain of a betrayed mother now traveled the world like a flame that ignited others. Helen had become universal, even though she had never planned anything so grand. Michael formally assumed the presidency of the foundation, but always made a point of remembering that he was merely a guardian of his mother's work. In speeches, he would say, "I didn't build this. She did, with every silent night, every penny saved, every hidden tear. I'm just continuing what she started." His humility further strengthened Helen's image, demonstrating that the legacy wasn't a vanity project, but a collective movement. Linda, for her part, remained active until her final days, always reminding new generations of the importance of friendship and loyalty. She often told simple stories about Helen, how she loved the smell of coffee in the morning, how she lovingly tended the garden, how she laughed quietly when she saw her grandchildren running. These details humanized the myth, reminding everyone that before becoming a symbol, Helen was just an ordinary woman with fears and affections. As the years passed, Helen's case entered school textbooks. Children learned not only about her struggle, but also about the dangers of neglect and elder abuse. Teachers used her story as an example of citizenship, showing that dignity knows no age and that a single person's voice can change laws and customs. Helen, who spent her life believing herself invisible, was now studied by new generations. On the foundation's 10th anniversary, a grand ceremony was held. Women from across the country traveled to pay tribute. Some carried signs with quotes inspired by Helen. Others brought letters of thanks. Images of her journey were shown on the screen. The simplicity of her youth, her hospital bed, her public speeches, her embraces of women who had found hope. At the end, a quote from her appeared. "Today is the day your mother said she outlived." The entire auditorium fell silent, moved. At that same event, Michael revealed a surprise. The foundation would begin funding research projects on dignified aging at universities. "My mother believed that the future only exists if we look at our elders with respect. This is our way of honoring her vision." The announcement was met with a standing ovation. It was as if Helen continued to chart a course even in her absence. Over the years, several women who passed through the foundation wrote their own stories. Books, articles, and lectures appeared, always citing Helen as an inspiration. She had planted not only an institutional work, but a culture of resistance. Her strength lay not only within the foundation's walls, but in the heart of every woman who dared to say, "I too survived." The phrase "I survived" became a motto for women's movements. Emblazoned on t-shirts, posters, and social campaigns, it wasn't just about surviving an attempted murder, but about resisting all forms of erasure, abandonment, invisibility, emotional violence. Helen, even without being present, continued to offer people a way to name their own strength. Her story had become a collective language. Over time, even Diana began to be viewed differently by society, not as the villain of a tragedy, but as a symbol of a misguided choice in the face of ambition. Helen never had contact with her daughter again, but her decision not to harbor hatred left room for a broader narrative that dignity can be born even in the most barren terrain. Helen's silent forgiveness, never proclaimed in public, was remembered as a gesture of liberation. In the foundation's last records, a phrase was engraved in marble in the main hall. Helen Carowway's true legacy was not the millions she saved, but the certainty that it is never too late to reclaim one's voice. This symbolic epitaph summed up her entire life in one line, from a silent and betrayed mother to a woman who reinterpreted her pain as a collective strength. And so, Helen Carowway's story found its memorable conclusion, not in the tears of the hospital, nor in the fury of the courtroom, but in the legacy that blossomed after her passing. Her name, engraved in hearts and institutions, continued to echo like a beacon, because in the end, Helen not only outlived her daughter, she survived oblivion and wrote with dignity the final chapter of her own story.